The evidence is clear. Climate change poses an existential threat to our lives, to our economy, and the threat is here. It's not going to get any better. The question, can it get worse?
The impact of climate change in the United States as President Joe Biden tours areas damaged by Hurricane Ida. We take a look at some of the growing effects of the climate crisis in other parts of the world. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Extreme weather has underscored the urgency for global cooperation on climate change. As the climate crisis accelerates, Africa is warming fast, with the most vulnerable hit the hardest. Experts warn that India will likely face irreversible damage from increasing heat waves, droughts and erratic rainfall if it doesn't reduce its carbon footprint. And climate patterns in Guatemala have produced years of failed harvests, forcing a growing number of people to consider migration to escape food insecurity and poverty. Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Chris Lennard is a senior researcher with the University of Cape Town's Climate System Analysis Group. Edwin Castellanos is director of the Sustainable Economic Observatory at the University of the Valley of Guatemala. Also with us, Lisa Viscidi heads the Inter-American Dialogue's Energy, Climate Change and Extractive Industries program. And Sweta Chakraborty is back with us. She's the president of U.S. operations for We Don't Have Time. That's the social network that launched environmental activist Greta Thunberg. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Sweta, let me start with you. There's a new report out by the World Meteorological Organization which says, in part, that floods, heat waves and forest fires have multiplied by a factor of 5 over the last 50 years. They've even put a price on this in monetary terms. They say this has cost $3.64 trillion. Looking at the big picture here, Sweta, are developing countries with small economies, different priorities in many instances, really willing, able, and most importantly, can they afford to implement measures to mitigate these circumstances?
That's a great question. I would switch it and say, can they afford not to? We know as the global temperature average increases that those countries that are least resilient to impacts of climate change will be most at risk. And those tend to be those that are developing, those that are smaller, those that don't have the infrastructure in place or a plan for resiliency in the face of these increasing and more frequent and more simultaneous impacts of climate change. And so it's really up to developed countries and those that have been historic polluters and are continuing to contribute the most amount of carbon emissions currently, like the United States, like China, like India, to support the countries that need that help in building their resiliency. These countries and the world fully needs to adapt to this new environment and needs to mitigate away from more worst-case scenarios becoming a reality. That's what this report has stated very clearly. That's what we know, and that's what we need to focus on now going into COP26.
And Sweta, what about financing these projects in developing countries? I mean, they're going to have to get finance from richer countries. Is that forthcoming?
That needs to be part of the discussions, and it is part of the discussions that will be coming up in Glasgow this November. So adoption to the reality of the planet warming, mitigation away from more worst-case scenarios occurring, and financing and supporting those countries that are most vulnerable to these impacts. So that's very much part of the discussion, and that is what that's what the world will be focusing on and watching closely as part of the diplomatic negotiations that will occur the first few days of COP26.
Lisa, great to have you with us on the show. What is your assessment of the disproportionate impact that the climate crisis is having on developing countries?
Well, I think we're seeing that developing countries are facing much more severe impacts of climate change, especially because many of them are closer to the equator. So these are regions that are already hotter, and they already face more droughts, and droughts are getting worse. Also in the Caribbean, for example, it's the hurricane zone. So we see stronger and stronger hurricanes that cause more and more flooding. In terms of who's responsible or who should do more, I think we're at a crisis point now where every country needs to do as much as they can. But that said, the larger emitters need to do more because that will have much more of an impact. And I also think that the larger emitters definitely need to help support climate change adaptation for the smaller, poorer countries to deal with the effects of climate change.
All right, let's go to Cape Town to Chris Lennard. Chris, welcome to the show. Great to have you. As that report that I was talking about points out, climate change is hitting Africa very hard. We've seen floods, droughts, extreme heat, which in turn is affecting food production on the continent, among other things. We know that the continent is heating up very fast. Where have you been seeing the greatest impact?
Largely in heat stress. So we have a very strong signal that things are getting hotter. So the average temperature of the entire continent is getting hotter, and it's warming just a little bit higher than the global land average. So the average trend is going up, but then also on that average trend you have extremes. Droughts and heat waves are part of the natural cycle normally, but as we get warmer, the droughts and heat waves, particularly heat waves and days above 35 and very many heat extremes, are increasing above the tolerance level of humans and also of animals and of crops. So in terms of heat, we have very strong evidence that even now, like we're at 1 degree almost, or just over 1 degree of warming since pre-industrial. But even now, the impact of heat and heat extremes on our agriculture, on our livestock, is taking a toll already. I mean, since 1961, our growth in terms of agriculture has dropped by about 34%. So it really is, we're already feeling global climate change, global warming in terms of our agriculture here.
And Chris, if you look at a country like South Africa, which is where you are right now, how much of a priority is this? You know, we know that governments in developing countries often have other priorities, and they think in terms of election cycles. You know, let's deal with what we can right now until the next election, and then this doesn't become a priority. But you know, what is your experience in South Africa?
In terms of mitigation, so trying to move away from our fossil fuel dependency for energy, our current government really acknowledges the problem that we need to move to renewables, and we're trying to get there in terms of our the amount of renewable energy that we're trying to bring in to the country. So our government recognizes it at the moment, but again, as Speaker said earlier, it's the funding. I mean, we've just been smashed by COVID. How are we going to pay for adaptation? And there's a very big difference also between the financial response. Is the finance for adaptation? So do we adapt to something that's coming? Or is the finance for mitigation? So do we try and move to a more renewable energy base? And they're two very different things, because if you're doing mitigation, so if you're a company, you're Siemens Vestas or something like that, and you're coming into South Africa to build turbines or sell turbines, you're getting a return on your investment. So for mitigation, there seems to be a possible return. But if we are to adapt, and most African countries can only adapt, it's very difficult for African countries to mitigate. And adaptation, there's no return for an investor. Adaptation is usually a loan from the World Bank or from the African Development Bank. And loans come with a harness, with a noose around your neck, really, because you've got to pay back that loan. And in our current financial context with COVID, that's just ravaged our continent and the finances of our continent, it's a really hard place to be for adaptation. So we can see a return for mitigation, for moving towards more renewable energy sources. But how do we adapt to these very many? So the IPCC Working Group 1 report has just been released, and it was pretty sobering. So yeah, how do we adapt to that, and who's going to pay for it?
Edwin, let's talk about Guatemala. Great to see you as well. We know that in Guatemala, shifting weather is making it very hard for small farmers to feed their families. We know that crops like sugarcane, coffee, corn have been hit. Harvests have been hit there. Where are you seeing the most impact?
Well, the situation is that the overall warming of the planet is really changing the rainfall patterns that we observe in the area. Farmers here are used to rainfall always coming every year during the month of May. So they usually plant in April, waiting for this rainfall to water their fields. A lot of these small farmers are really relying on rainfall for watering their fields. And the problem is that this early rainfall is now decreasing. So the months of May and June are now getting drier and drier. And so the risk for these farmers to lose their crops is much higher. And then at the end of the rainy season, which used to happen in October, now that rainy season is extending to November, and we get a lot of the rain that we didn't get early on toward the end of the rainy season, when the fields are already flooded and when there's already too much water on the ground.
Sweta, let's look at the world's third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. That's India, behind the United States and China. We look at this report. It says India will face irreversible impacts from climate change if no mitigation efforts are undertaken. The government says it's on target, but the recent IPCC report says that those targets are slipping away. And now India says that any further commitments to cutting greenhouse gases will depend on financing. What do you make of the situation there?
It's a tricky situation because the goals have been put forward that the nationally determined contributions that India will pledge to leading up to COP26 are on target. That being said, the blueprint to how to actually reach those targets still needs to be made clear. Now, recently, solar has become more affordable than putting forward new coal power plants, and that's a huge win for India. That being said, the transition to fully renewable has a long way to go. Renewable energy in India is still in the single digits of the overall energy portfolio, and so if we're really going to protect India, which is extremely vulnerable to climate change impacts, from heat waves to heavy flooding to typhoons like we saw Amphan last year in 2020 really impact the Bay of Bengal and the cities near there, displacing 2.4 billion people. And so these are the types of impacts that India can see increasing in frequency if this renewable transition to clean energy doesn't happen.
What about the generation of energy? Is there a shift away from fossil fuels?
There is an increasing shift away from fossil fuels, but it needs to really increase. And Deloitte has reported that India could save something like $13 trillion by 2070 if this transition is sped up. And without that transition, we're looking at a cost for the country at 30 or 40 trillion. So it's really cost effective and better for India's future overall to put in the investment up front in the billions to have these savings of trillions down the line. That's what India needs to contend with leading up to COP26.
Lisa, there was a report produced by the Climate Reality Project which says that without firmer action to limit emissions, up to 140 million people in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as South Asia, could be displaced. And if you look at Latin America right now, are we already seeing large-scale displacement of people?
Yes, I think there definitely is migration tied to climate change, both within countries and to other countries. It's difficult to know exactly who migrated because of climate change because it tends to be the result of a confluence of factors. So in the United States, we're very focused right now on immigration from Central America, especially some of the northern countries of Central America to the United States. We believe that climate change is one of the factors, and it's going to increasingly be a factor. But there are other issues as well, such as escaping violence, reuniting with family members in the U.S. But I think what's clear is that in Central America, climate change has really affected people's livelihoods, especially in the agricultural sector. The increasing droughts and floods make it much more difficult for people to produce the agricultural yields that they had in the past and have some predictability. So this just is another factor contributing to migration. And that's just the case of Central America. There are also in South America, there are internal migrants as well as migration among different countries resulting from the impacts of climate change. In South America, glacier melt from the Andes is really changing water resources and rainfall patterns, as well as hydroelectricity availability. So all of this affects people's livelihoods and can be a factor in their decision to move.
Chris Lennard, getting back to that report that we were talking about, the World Meteorological Organization report, it says that in Africa, climate change is expected to affect every aspect of life, from health to food security, as well as economic growth. This is the Secretary General of the WMO, Petteri Talkas, talking about that. Let's listen.
In the future, we expect to see both the population growth especially in Africa, and the climate change having a combined effect. If we are going to see 4 billion inhabitants in Africa by the end of this century, together with more severe drought events both in northern and southern part of Africa, this will for sure lead to major displacement and crisis and perhaps also refugee crisis.
So, Chris, that's a dire warning there, a really alarming scenario that's painted by Petteri Talkas there. From what we are seeing, are parts of Africa headed for major displacement and, as he points out, a refugee crisis?
It's kind of already happening, and this is the rural to urban migration. It's usually not across international borders, but there is a massive movement from rural areas to urban areas, and that is a migration that's been happening over the last decades. And that brings with it many problems, because with more people in big cities, you've got to be able to feed them, they've got to be able to get employed, there's got to be enough water. When a natural disaster happens, it happens on a concentrated group of people in a big city. If your big city is near the coast, for example, like Lagos or like Cape Town, you have threat from oceans, from storms, from sea level rise. If you're on the east coast of Africa, from tropical cyclones. So it is already a big problem, perhaps not so much in an international context, but certainly the rural-urban migration is here. It's upon us already.
Right, and you're also seeing a lot of economic migration as well in parts of Africa, aren't you? For instance, you see a lot of people from the poorer countries of Africa moving to the relatively richer countries.
Yeah, sure. And South Africa is a recipient of these folk who in their countries there's no potential for work, there's no hope for work. So they will travel thousands of kilometers, leave their families at home to spend years away from their families just so that they can send some money back to them. So yeah, that's definitely there.
Edwin, Politico, which is the political newspaper published here in Washington, it reports that climate change will exacerbate an already dire situation in Guatemala, with more and more people migrating to urban areas as well as to Mexico and, of course, to the United States as well. We know that this kind of migration is a hot-button political issue here in the United States. But, you know, the United States has said that they will put money into Central America, for instance, to improve economies there so people don't have to travel north to the United States. But do you find that the United States is reluctant to make that connection between climate change and the migration northwards?
Well, it's a difficult situation because definitely climate change is one of the factors, but that factor is really coming on top of previous situations, socioeconomic conditions, very high poverty levels, for example, especially in rural areas, violence as well. But especially the lack of opportunities for communities in rural areas are the background to where this climate change situation is coming on top. And then on top of that, we also have the situation of corruption in the government and elsewhere in the country. And so a lot of the efforts to bring aid to these rural communities are often found with situations in which the money doesn't come to the people who really need it. And so it's a complicated situation, because even though these people living in poverty don't really need much to make a better living, oftentimes the aid money that comes into the country doesn't make it to these families.
And Edwin, are you seeing a big change in recent years? Because I was reading one report which said that people in a country like Guatemala, people who live in rural areas, rarely left their homes, even to travel to the urban parts of the country. But are you seeing that change now in the last few years?
Well, yeah, for sure. Before there is a migration to international destinations, the first migration is from rural to urban areas. Migrating to the U.S. is not really inexpensive. A family in a rural area can pay up to $10,000 per person to migrate to the U.S. And you can imagine for a family living in poverty, $10,000 is a lot of money. And so oftentimes the very extreme poor cannot migrate. And what happens is that the people who have at least a little move into the cities to work for a while, make enough money to and then be able to pay for this international migration. So this cycle of moving from rural to urban and then international has been increasing in the last year for sure.
Sweta, the Diplomat recently published a piece in which it said that there is a dire need for more regional cooperation along the Indian Ocean Rim. It talks specifically about that area, and in fact the IPCC report points out that the Indian Ocean itself is heating at a faster rate than other oceans around the world. We know that this is a region, the Indian Ocean Rim, that accommodates up to 1/3 of the world's population. Is it time to resuscitate organizations like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which for some reason went dormant, so that countries along this rim can cooperate with each other?
If there was ever a reason to cooperate regionally, it's climate change. Climate change does not respect political borders. And in addition to the ocean, which we barely know the extent to which the warming oceans are going to be impacting the globe overall, we're just at the surface of the ocean, no pun intended, in the surface of information that we know in terms of what the warming will do to marine ecosystems and beyond. In addition to that, we have the Himalayas, the glaciers of the Himalayas, which are melting, and the glaciers supply 2 billion people with fresh water and are important for 10 different critical rivers. And so oceans and rivers and glaciers and all of these different water sources are relevant for water security issues of a region that, again, does not respect political borders. So yes, we absolutely need regional cooperation. We need to recognize that climate change is impacting the health of just environment and animals and humans. It's a full holistic look at this big picture of impact that if we don't cooperate, we are going to desperately wish we had.
Lisa, when we look at the impact of climate change, it seems so overwhelming. You know, as Sweta pointed out a moment ago, there's the oceans are heating up. We see coastal degradation. We see glaciers melting. We see droughts in some circumstances, flooding in other circumstances. If we look at Chile, Chile is now facing the worst drought in its history, more than a decade long. This is what the country's science and technology minister had to say. Let's listen to him.
We already have overwhelming evidence, and it's climatic. We're seeing a very significant decrease in rainfall, and that's generating water shortages. In this sense, we talk about Chile as a vulnerable country. But Chile will have the greatest water stress by 2040. Some regions have an 80% precipitation deficit, so it's an extremely serious situation.
So when the minister there talks about water stress, Lisa, I mean, what's the outlook for the country in the years ahead?
Well, Chile is one of the countries of the world that faces the biggest challenge in terms of water resources. Already, it's a country that has a very dry area because the whole north is a desert. And as the surface of the earth heats up, the water evaporates more quickly. In addition to that, the glaciers are already shrinking, which has been providing a major water source. And Chile also depends a lot on water. So obviously for the agricultural sector, irrigation is very important. But Chile also has a very big mining sector. It's a big part of its economy. And mining activities actually use a lot of water too. And a lot of them are happening in the northern desert where there's shortages. So we're kind of talking about a series of factors that are creating more water shortages, while at the same time industries that need a lot of water. So I think that Chile is one of the countries that's looking further ahead on the horizon than some others, and so they have the ability to prepare. They're already looking at desalination technologies in order to use seawater as a source of fresh water. They're looking, of course, at water conservation techniques and improving those. But I do think that this case shows how not mitigating climate change is actually more costly, as was said at the beginning, than mitigating it, because both it affects your economic activity when you have impacts of climate change, and it costs a lot to adapt to it. I think Chile is getting prepared, but it really shows how difficult and costly this issue is.
Chris Lennard, getting back to Africa, we know that agriculture is the backbone of Africa's economy. It accounts for the majority of jobs on the continent as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, which has been prone to droughts, the number of undernourished people has increased by almost half. That's just over 45% since 2012. Where could this be heading? I mean, it could be heading for serious instability on the continent, couldn't it?
Yeah, because the source of the nourishment is getting hit by climate change. So it gets reduced in many parts of the country. So, for example, staple foods, staple cereals are going to, in the 2050s, the amount of agricultural produce of these staples reduces in West Africa and Central Africa in particular by almost 10%. Compared to what we've got now. So it is a massive reduction in yield of the staple foods of many countries. It'll be similar for maize and similar for wheat also here in South Africa. We're a large maize and wheat growing region, and that's what we're facing. It's a huge reduction in yield of our staple crops. Sorghum in West Africa is a really big one that also reduces by about 15% if we hit 3 degrees of global warming.
Edwin, I'm going to get back to something that I talked about right at the beginning of the show, and that is the question of priorities when it comes to fighting climate change, especially in the developing world. Sometimes it's the immediate needs and efforts of these countries may not have climate change at the top. You know, these countries want to grow their economies. There's also big issues on security as well. But do you think that's changing? Is there recognition now that climate change poses a huge threat and needs to be moved up to the top of the priority list?
Well, at least in the discourse, I think the politicians are changing, and they are mentioning climate change more often in their speeches. But in practice, when you look at assignations of budgeting, you see that climate change and other environmental problems are really left in the bottom of the list. And so it is true that when the resources are so scarce, what we have is that the most immediate problems are the ones that get the funding. And that is the difficulty for all countries, being able to invest in a problem that is already a problem now, but it will be bigger in the future. And so for politicians who are thinking of a 4-year term, it is very difficult to start thinking how to prepare for this long-term situation.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.